3 days before Christmas, Thomas Reed, a black single father, received a termination letter filled with damning accusations, threatening co-workers, falsifying time records, creating a hostile work environment. The signature at the bottom belonged to Claire Bennett, the HR director who had never spoken to him before that morning. But hours later, as Thomas picked up his daughter from elementary school, Claire happened to drive past and witnessed something that shattered everything she thought she knew. The file had called him dangerous. The man she saw was anything but. The apartment smelled like cinnamon and cheap pine. Thomas Reed stood on a wobbly step stool, holding a plastic star, while his daughter balanced on the armrest of their second-hand couch, arms stretched toward him. "Higher, Daddy." "It has to touch the ceiling." Ava's voice carried that particular pitch of 7-year-old certainty that made disagreement impossible. Thomas smiled, despite the ache in his lower back from the early shift. He raised the star another inch and secured it to the top of their small artificial tree. The thing had cost him $15 at a discount store 3 years ago, right after his wife died. And every December since then, he and Ava performed this same ritual, decorating it with mismatched ornaments, tangled lights, and whatever Ava had made in art class that week. "Perfect," she declared, clapping her hands. The sound echoed in their small living room, past the kitchen table where Thomas left his work boots every night, past the pile of bills he kept face down near the microwave. He climbed down and lifted Ava off the couch in one smooth motion. She wrapped her arms around his neck. "Mommy would like it, right?" she asked. Thomas held her a little tighter. 3 years had passed since the night a nurse had told him his wife's heart had simply stopped. No warning. No goodbye. Just a phone call that split his life into before and after. He still kept her photo on the nightstand, still sometimes woke up reaching for her side of the bed. "She'd love it, baby," he said. "Just like she'd love you." Ava pulled back to look at him. She had her mother's eyes, wide and dark, and impossibly trusting. "Do you think she can see us from heaven?" Thomas had answered this question a dozen different ways over the years, and he still didn't know which version was true, but he knew which one helped his daughter sleep at night. "Every single day," he said. She seemed satisfied with that. She wriggled free and ran to the kitchen to pour herself a cup of juice, humming a Christmas song she'd learned at school. The melody was wrong, but the joy in it was real. Thomas checked the clock on the wall. 9:45. He had to be at the factory by 6 the next morning, which meant 4 hours of sleep if he was lucky. After his shift ended at 2 in the afternoon, he'd pick up Ava from school, help her with homework, make dinner, and then head to the grocery store on 5th Street, where the manager sometimes let him haul boxes for cash under the table. It wasn't much, but it kept them afloat. Barely. He looked at the small envelope tucked behind the coffee maker. Inside was $230, saved over 3 months. He'd been planning to buy Ava a bicycle for Christmas. Not new, but good enough. A girl at her school had gotten one for her birthday, and Ava had mentioned it exactly once, in that careful way kids did when they wanted something but didn't want to ask. Thomas would make it happen. He always did. The factory where Thomas worked sat on the edge of town, a gray building surrounded by chain-link fencing and employee parking that never had enough spaces. He'd been there 4 years, ever since a friend told him they were hiring, and didn't ask too many questions about gaps in resumes. The work was repetitive: assembly line monitoring, quality checks, inventory counts. But it was steady. The managers left him alone. His co-workers respected him, or at least he thought they did. On the morning of December 22nd, Thomas clocked in at 5:58, 2 minutes early like always. He nodded to Marcus, a guy his age who worked the same shift, and grabbed his safety vest from the rack. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed in that particular frequencies that made everything feel slightly unreal. At 7:30, his supervisor, a man named Brian Holt, appeared at the end of the line and gestured for Thomas to follow him. "Got a minute?" Brian asked. Thomas wiped his hands on his pants and nodded. Brian had been his manager for 2 years. They didn't talk much outside of work instructions, but there had never been tension between them. Thomas kept his head down, did his job, went home. They walked to the administrative wing, past the break room where someone had hung garland over the vending machines. Brian's office was small and windowless, with a desk covered in spreadsheets and a calendar still turned to November. But they didn't stop there. Brian led him to a larger office at the end of the hall. The nameplate on the door read, Claire Bennett, Human Resources Director. Thomas had never been inside. He'd seen Claire around the building a few times. A woman in her 40s, always in business clothes, always carrying a tablet or a stack of folders. She had the look of someone who lived inside systems and trusted them completely. She was sitting behind her desk when they entered. Her expression was neutral, unreadable. "Mr. Reed," she said, "please sit down." Thomas sat. Brian remained standing near the door, arms crossed. Claire opened a folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. Thomas recognized the company letterhead. "I'm afraid we're terminating your employment, effective immediately," she said. The words didn't register at first. Thomas stared at the paper, at the bold text near the top that read, "Notice of termination for cause." Below that, a list of accusations: threatening behavior toward coworkers, falsification of time records, creation of a hostile work environment. He looked up at Claire. "I don't understand." She folded her hands on the desk. Her tone remained even, professional. "Multiple employees have filed complaints. We take workplace safety very seriously. Based on the documentation provided, we have no choice but to proceed with termination." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. He looked at Brian, who avoided his gaze. "What employees?" Thomas asked. "I haven't threatened anyone." Claire tapped the folder. "The complaints are confidential, but the process has been followed. You'll receive your final paycheck by mail within 7 business days." Thomas wanted to argue, to demand names, to ask how any of this made sense. But he'd been poor long enough to know that fighting systems rarely worked. The people who built the systems always won. He stood slowly. "Can I at least know who reported this?" Claire's expression didn't change. "That information is protected." Thomas nodded. He looked at Brian one more time, searching for something. Guilt, discomfort, anything. But Brian's face was blank. "I need to get my things," Thomas said. Claire gestured towards the door. "You have 15 minutes." He walked back to his station in a daze. The other workers glanced at him but didn't ask questions. He cleaned out his locker. A spare shirt. A water bottle. A photo of Ava he kept taped inside the door. Everything fit into a plastic grocery bag. Marcus caught up with him in the parking lot. "Man, what happened?" Marcus asked. Thomas shook his head. "I got fired." "For what?" "They said I threatened people. Made up my hours." Marcus frowned. "That's bullshit. You're the quietest guy here." Thomas appreciated that, but it didn't change anything. He got in his car and drove home, the plastic bag sitting on the passenger seat, like evidence of a crime he didn't commit. When he got home, the apartment was silent. Ava wouldn't be back from school for hours. Thomas sat on the couch and stared at their Christmas tree. The star at the top tilted slightly to the left. He thought about the $230 behind the coffee maker. He thought about rent, about groceries, about the fact that he now had no income and no explanation to give his daughter. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since the night his wife died. But he sat there for a long time, trying to figure out what he'd done wrong. That evening, Thomas stood outside a small grocery store on 5th Street, wearing a jacket too thin for the cold. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Brennan, had called him earlier in the week, asking if he could help unload a delivery truck. She paid in cash, $20 an hour, no questions asked. He needed the work now more than ever. The truck arrived at 6. Thomas spent the next 2 hours hauling boxes of canned goods and produce into the stockroom, stacking them according to Mrs. Brennan's shouted instructions. His back ached. His hands were numb, but he didn't stop. When they finished, Mrs. Brennan handed him $40. "You're a lifesaver, Thomas," she said. "I'll call you next week if I need help again." Thomas folded the bills into his pocket. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it." "You doing okay?" she asked, studying his face. "You seem tired." He forced a smile. "Just a long day." She nodded, unconvinced, but didn't press. Thomas walked back to his car, passing a coffee shop where a line of customers waited for overpriced lattes. Through the window, he saw a woman sitting alone at a corner table, typing on a laptop. It was Claire Bennett. Thomas stopped. He didn't know why. Maybe curiosity. Maybe anger. Maybe just the surreal feeling of seeing the person who had ended his livelihood sitting comfortably in a warm cafe while he stood outside in the cold. Claire looked up briefly, as if she felt someone watching. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Then she returned to her screen, unaware or unconcerned. Thomas kept walking. The next afternoon, Thomas stood outside Ava's elementary school, watching the doors for her familiar purple backpack. Parents clustered in small groups near the entrance, talking and laughing. Thomas stayed near his car, apart from them. The bell rang. Kids poured out in a chaotic stream of noise and motion. Ava appeared near the back, walking with a friend. When she saw Thomas, her face lit up. She ran to him, and he knelt down automatically, catching her in a hug. "Daddy, you're early," she said. He pulled back and adjusted the strap of her backpack. "I got off work a little sooner today." It wasn't a lie, exactly. He just didn't mention that he no longer had work to get off from. Ava's shoelace had come undone. Thomas retied it carefully, double knotting it the way she liked. She rested her hand on his shoulder for balance, humming that same off-key Christmas song. "Can we get hot chocolate?" she asked. Thomas stood and took her hand. "Sure, baby. Let's go." They walked toward his car, and Ava chattered about her day. Something about an art project. Something about a boy who'd gotten in trouble for talking during reading time. Thomas listened, nodding in the right places, trying to ignore the weight pressing down on his chest. What he didn't see was the silver sedan parked across the street. Claire Bennett sat behind the wheel, her hand still gripping the steering wheel even though the engine was off. She'd left work early, claiming a headache, and had driven aimlessly through town trying to clear her mind. She'd ended up here by accident, or maybe not by accident. Maybe some part of her had needed to see him again, to reconcile the man in the file with the man she'd fired. And now she was watching him kneel in front of his daughter, tying her shoe with the kind of patience Claire had only seen in people who truly loved what they were doing. She watched him smile as the girl said something that made him laugh. She watched them walk hand in hand toward an old car that looked like it barely ran. This was the man she'd called dangerous. This was the man whose livelihood she'd ended 3 days before Christmas. Claire sat in her car long after Thomas and his daughter had driven away. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty schoolyard. She thought about the folder on her desk, about the complaints she'd reviewed, about the process she'd trusted without question. And for the first time in 12 years of working in human resources, Claire Bennett wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Claire couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her empty house, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene outside the elementary school. The way Thomas had knelt so carefully, the way his daughter had rested her hand on his shoulder, trusting and light. The way he'd smiled at her, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. At 2 a.m, Claire gave up on sleep. She went to her home office and opened her laptop, pulling up the termination file she'd approved that morning. The complaints had come through the system on December 19th, all submitted within hours of each other. 5 employees, all claiming that Thomas Reed had engaged in threatening behavior. The language was formal, almost identical across all statements. One claimed he'd cornered a coworker in the break room. Another said he'd made aggressive comments about management. A third reported that he'd falsified time records to steal hours. Claire read through them again, more carefully this time. She'd reviewed hundreds of termination cases over the years. She knew what real complaints looked like. Messy, emotional, filled with specific details. These read like templates, like someone had drafted them and distributed them for signatures. She opened the metadata on the files. All 5 had been submitted from the same IP address. All 5 within a 12-minute window. Claire sat back in her chair. Her chest felt tight. She thought about the process she'd followed. Brian Holt had brought her the complaints on December 20th, already compiled in a neat folder. He'd explained that Thomas had become increasingly difficult, that other employees were afraid to work with him. Claire had asked the standard questions. Had anyone spoken to Thomas about his behavior? Had there been warnings? Brian had said yes. Said Thomas had been defensive. Said the situation was escalating. Claire had trusted him. She always trusted managers to tell the truth. That was how the system worked. But now, in the quiet of her house with no one watching, she allowed herself to doubt. The next morning, Claire arrived at the office an hour early. The building was nearly empty, just a few maintenance workers and the night security guard finishing his shift. She made coffee in the break room and carried it back to her desk, where she spent the next 40 minutes pulling employee records. Marcus Wright, 4 years at the company, same shift as Thomas Reed. No disciplinary history. Claire noted his employee number and drafted an email asking him to meet with her privately. She sent similar requests to 2 other names on the complaint list, Sarah Miller and David Torres. Then she sat back and waited. Marcus arrived first, at 9:30. He looked nervous when he stepped into her office, the way most employees did when HR called them in unexpectedly. "Am I in trouble?" he asked, standing near the door. Claire gestured to the chair across from her desk. "No, I just need to clarify something about a complaint you filed." Marcus sat slowly. "What complaint?" Claire opened the folder and showed him the statement with his signature at the bottom. "This one. You reported that Thomas Reed engaged in threatening behavior toward you on December 18th. Marcus leaned forward, scanning the document. His frown deepened. "I didn't write this," he said. Claire felt her pulse quicken. "But that's your signature." Marcus shook his head. "I mean, yeah, that's my name. But I didn't write any of this. Thomas never threatened me. He barely talks to anyone." "Then how did your signature end up on this document?" Marcus looked uncomfortable. He glanced at the door, then back at Claire. "Brian asked me to sign something last week," he said quietly. "He said it was just an internal thing, some kind of shift scheduling form. I didn't read it. I just signed where he told me to." Claire kept her face neutral, but her mind was racing. "Did Brian ask anyone else to sign forms?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah. Sarah, David, a couple other guys. We all thought it was normal paperwork." Claire made a note on her tablet. "Thank you for being honest. This conversation stays between us." Marcus stood, still looking uncertain. "Is Thomas okay?" "I heard he got fired." "I'm looking into it," Claire said. After Marcus left, Claire sat alone in her office, staring at the folder. She felt a cold, creeping anger building in her chest. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the quiet, steady kind that came from realizing you'd been manipulated. She called Sarah next. The conversation was shorter, but confirmed the same thing. Brian had asked her to sign a document, claimed it was routine, never explained what it actually said. By lunchtime, Claire had spoken to 4 of the 5 names on the complaints. All of them told the same story. The 5th employee, a man named Kyle Stevens, didn't answer her email. Claire checked his personnel file and found that he'd been transferred to a different facility 2 weeks ago. Convenient. She needed to confront Brian, but she needed evidence first. Something concrete that he couldn't explain away. That afternoon, Claire went to the security office. The company kept digital records of all surveillance footage for 30 days before erasing it. She asked the security manager, a quiet man named Greg, who'd worked there longer than anyone, to pull video from the administrative wing for December 18th. "Anything specific you're looking for?" Greg asked. "Just need to verify some timestamps," Claire said. Greg didn't ask questions. He pulled up the footage and let her scroll through it on his monitor. Claire fast-forwarded through hours of empty hallways and occasional foot traffic until she reached the evening shift, after most of the office staff had gone home. At 7:43, Brian Holt appeared on the screen. He walked into the records room, a small office where employee files were stored, and stayed there for 26 minutes. When he left, he was carrying a folder. Claire asked Greg to pull footage from 2 days later. Same pattern. Brian entering the records room alone, staying for a long period, leaving with documents. "Can you make me a copy of this?" Claire asked. Greg burned the footage onto a drive and handed it to her without comment. Claire returned to her office and opened the company's financial database. She didn't have full access to payroll records, but she could see time clock data for her department. She started pulling reports for Brian's team, comparing submitted hours against actual clock-in times. It took her 3 hours, but eventually the pattern emerged. Over the past 2 years, dozens of overtime hours had been logged under employee IDs that didn't match the security footage of who was actually in the building. The hours had been approved by Brian and processed through payroll. Someone had been falsifying time records. But it wasn't Thomas Reed. It was Brian Holt. Claire sat back in her chair, feeling sick. She thought about all the times she'd trusted the system, trusted the processes, trusted that people in positions of authority were acting in good faith. She'd built her entire career on that trust, and now she had to decide whether to protect that system or tear it apart. Her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Brian Holt. She let it ring twice before answering. "Claire, do you have a minute?" Brian's voice was casual, friendly. "I wanted to touch base about the Reed termination. Make sure everything's finalized." Claire kept her tone even. "It's handled." "Good. Good. I know those situations are never easy, but you did the right thing. Guy was a liability." Claire said nothing. Brian continued, filling the silence. "Listen, I also wanted to give you a heads up. I've been hearing some rumors that you've been asking questions about the case. Just want to make sure we're on the same page. The process was followed. Everything's documented. We don't want to create unnecessary complications." There it was, the subtle warning disguised as concern. "I'm just doing my due diligence," Claire said. Brian's tone shifted slightly, losing some of its warmth. "Of course. But sometimes due diligence can look like second-guessing, and that can make people uncomfortable. You know how it is. Leadership likes to see confidence in decisions." Claire felt her jaw tighten. She thought about all the years she'd spent playing this game, navigating office politics, protecting her position. And she thought about Thomas Reed, kneeling in front of his daughter, tying her shoe in the cold. "I appreciate your concern, Brian," she said, "but I'm comfortable with how I'm handling this." There was a brief silence on the other end. "All right," Brian said finally, "just trying to help." He hung up. Claire sat at her desk for a long time after that, turning the USB drive over in her hands. She knew what would happen if she pursued this. Brian had allies in the company. He'd been there longer than she had. If she accused him of fraud and somehow failed to prove it, her career would be over. But if she did nothing, Thomas Reed would lose everything 3 days before Christmas for a crime he didn't commit. She thought about the empty house she'd go home to that night, the quiet rooms, the job that had filled the space where a family might have been. She'd told herself for years that the work mattered, that following the rules and maintaining the system was its own kind of purpose. But lately, she'd started to wonder if she'd just been hiding. Claire opened her email and began typing a message to the CEO. The next morning, Claire asked Thomas to meet her at a coffee shop off company property. She didn't explain why. She just sent a brief text. "I need to speak with you. It's important." Thomas arrived 15 minutes early, sitting at a corner table near the window. He looked tired, wearing the same jacket she'd seen him in outside the grocery store. When Claire walked in, he stood automatically, the kind of polite instinct that came from being raised to respect people even when they'd hurt you. "Thank you for meeting me," Claire said, sitting across from him. Thomas sat back down, watching her carefully. "I wasn't sure if I should come. I understand. But I need to tell you something, and I need to do it face to face." She pulled a folder from her bag and set it on the table between them. Thomas glanced at it, but didn't reach for it. "I reviewed your termination file," Claire said, "and I found inconsistencies. The complaints against you were falsified. The employees who supposedly filed them were coerced into signing documents they didn't read. And the person behind it was your manager, Brian Holt." Thomas stared at her. "Why?" "I think you saw something you weren't supposed to see, something that made Brian nervous." Thomas thought for a moment. Then his expression changed, like a memory clicking into place. "The timesheets," he said quietly. Claire leaned forward. "What about them?" 2 weeks ago, I was doing inventory in the storage room. Brian's computer was open on the desk. I wasn't trying to snoop, but I saw a spreadsheet with employee names and hours. Some of the numbers didn't match what I remembered from the schedule. I asked him if there was a mistake. What did he say? He closed the laptop and said everything was fine. Told me not to worry about it. Thomas shook his head. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I figured maybe I'd misread something. Claire opened the folder and showed him the payroll reports she'd compiled. He's been stealing overtime hours for 2 years, logging them under other employees' IDs and collecting the pay himself. You saw enough to make him nervous, so he decided to get rid of you before you could figure out what he was doing. Thomas looked at the documents, then at Claire. "So what happens now?" "I've reported it to the CEO. There's going to be an investigation. I can't promise you anything yet, but I wanted you to know the truth, and I wanted to apologize." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "You don't have to apologize," he said finally. "You were just doing your job." "I should have done it better," Claire said. "I should have asked more questions. I should have verified the information before I signed that termination letter. I took the easy path, and you paid the price." Thomas rubbed his face, looking suddenly exhausted. "I appreciate you telling me, but even if they reverse the decision, it doesn't change the fact that I've been out of work for 3 days right before Christmas. I've got a daughter who thinks everything's fine because I've been lying to her. I've got bills I can't pay, and I've got no idea how to fix any of it." Claire felt the weight of his words settle over her. She'd spent her career believing that following procedures was enough, that systems could substitute for judgment. But systems didn't feel shame. They didn't see the human cost of their failures. "I know this doesn't fix anything," Claire said. "But I'm going to do everything I can to make this right." Thomas looked at her, and something in his expression softened. Not forgiveness, exactly, but maybe the beginning of trust. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you risking your job for this?" Claire thought about that question. She thought about her empty house and her empty life, and all the ways she'd avoided taking risks, because risks meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of being hurt again. "Because the other night, I saw you with your daughter," she said, "and I realized that behind every file I've ever reviewed, there's a person, a life, a family, and maybe it's time I started treating them that way." Thomas nodded slowly. He stood and extended his hand. Claire shook it, feeling the calluses from years of factory work. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," Claire replied. "We still have to convince the company to admit they were wrong. That's not going to be easy." "Nothing ever is," Thomas said. He left the coffee shop, and Claire sat alone at the table, watching through the window as he walked back to his car. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, like she'd done something that mattered. On December 26th, the company convened an emergency board meeting. The conference room on the 3rd floor had windows that overlooked the parking lot. Thomas sat in one of the chairs along the wall, trying not to think about how much this room probably cost to furnish. The table was real wood. The chairs had leather upholstery. Everything about the space communicated power and permanence. Claire sat across from him, her tablet open in front of her. She'd organized everything: the falsified complaints, the security footage, the payroll discrepancies. The evidence was clear enough that even people who didn't want to believe it would have a hard time ignoring it. Brian Holt sat at the opposite end of the table, flanked by a lawyer the company had provided. He looked calm, almost bored, like this was just another tedious meeting he had to sit through. The CEO, a man in his 60s named Richard Brennan, sat at the head of the table. He'd been with the company for 30 years, working his way up from the factory floor. Thomas had never spoken to him directly, but he'd heard stories. People said Richard was fair. People said he cared about his workers. Thomas hoped that was true. Richard opened the meeting by summarizing Claire's report. He didn't editorialize. He just stated the facts in a flat, businesslike tone. When he finished, he looked at Brian. "Do you have a response to these allegations?" Richard asked. Brian's lawyer leaned forward. "My client denies any wrongdoing. The complaints against Mr. Reed were filed in good faith based on legitimate concerns about workplace safety. If there were administrative errors in how those complaints were documented, that's a process issue, not evidence of malicious intent." Claire spoke up. "The security footage shows Mr. Holt accessing employee records after hours on multiple occasions. The payroll data shows over time hours logged under employee IDs that don't correspond to actual work performed. Those aren't administrative errors. That's fraud." Brian finally spoke, his voice measured and reasonable. "I was reviewing records as part of my managerial duties. If there are discrepancies in the payroll system, that's an IT problem. I've been with this company for 12 years. I've never had a single complaint against me." Thomas listened to Brian talk, and he felt something close to pity, not for what Brian had done, but for how small it all was. The man had risked everything: his job, his reputation, possibly his freedom. For what? A few $1,000s in stolen overtime? It seemed like such a waste. Richard looked at Thomas. "Mr. Reed, do you have anything you'd like to say?" Thomas hadn't planned to speak. Claire had told him he didn't have to. The evidence spoke for itself. But now, with everyone looking at him, he felt like he owed them something. An explanation. A defense. Proof that he was more than just a name in a file. "I don't hold any grudges against this company," Thomas said quietly. "I've worked here for 4 years. It's been a good job. It let me provide for my daughter. That's all I ever wanted, to work hard and take care of my family." He glanced at Brian, then back at Richard. "I don't know why Mr. Holt did what he did. Maybe he had his reasons. But I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't falsify anything. I just showed up every day and did my job. And when I got fired, I didn't fight it because I figured the system knew something I didn't. I trusted that the people making decisions were acting in good faith." Thomas looked down at his hands. "My daughter asked me why the company didn't like me. I didn't know what to tell her. She's 7. She doesn't understand how things like this happen. And honestly, neither do I. But I want her to grow up knowing that even when people make mistakes, even when things are unfair, you don't have to become bitter. You just keep going." The room was quiet for a moment. Richard wrote something on the notepad in front of him. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," Richard said. Before anyone else could speak, the door opened. Thomas turned and felt his heart drop. Ava stood in the doorway, holding the hand of the receptionist who worked in the front lobby. She was wearing her purple backpack and the winter coat Thomas had bought her at a thrift store last year. "I'm so sorry," the receptionist said, looking flustered. "She was in the waiting area, and she just—" Ava let go of the receptionist's hand and walked straight to Thomas. She climbed into his lap without hesitation, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Daddy, you said you had an important meeting," she said. "I wanted to see." Thomas held her, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on them. "Baby, you're supposed to wait outside." "But I missed you," Ava said simply. Brian's lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Chairman, perhaps we could take a brief recess." "No," Richard said. He was looking at Ava with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. "Let her stay." Ava turned in Thomas's lap to look at the people around the table. Her eyes landed on Brian. "Are you the one who said my daddy was bad?" she asked. Brian didn't answer. He looked away, uncomfortable. Ava kept talking, her voice clear and certain in the way only children could be. "My daddy's not bad. He makes me breakfast every morning. He helps me with my homework even when he's tired. He reads me stories at night. And when I'm sad about Mommy, he hugs me and tells me it's okay to cry." She looked at Richard. "My daddy's the best person I know. He wouldn't hurt anybody." The room was completely silent. Richard set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying Ava with the kind of attention that came from really listening. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Richard asked. "Ava," she said. "Ava Reed." "It's nice to meet you, Ava. I'm Richard." Ava considered this. "Are you the boss?" "Something like that." "Then you can fix this, right? You can tell everyone my daddy didn't do anything wrong." Richard looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Thomas, at Claire, at the evidence spread across the table. "I think we have everything we need," Richard said. "Mr. Holt, you're suspended, pending a full investigation. Mr. Reed, you're reinstated effective immediately with full back pay. Claire, I want a complete review of our HR processes on my desk by the end of next week." Brian stood abruptly. "You can't just—" "I can," Richard said. "And I am. This meeting is over." Brian's lawyer started to object, but Richard cut him off with a look. Brian gathered his things and left the room without another word. His lawyer followed, muttering something about legal options. When they were gone, Richard stood and walked over to where Thomas sat with Ava still in his lap. "I'm sorry this happened," Richard said. "It shouldn't have, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." Thomas stood, setting Ava on her feet. "Thank you, sir." Richard shook his hand. "You've got a smart daughter. You should be proud." "I am," Thomas said. "Every day." Richard left. And then it was just Thomas, Ava, and Claire in the conference room. Claire gathered her materials, not looking at them. "I'll process your reinstatement paperwork today. You can start back next Monday if that works." "It works," Thomas said. "And Claire, thank you for all of this." Claire finally met his eyes. She looked tired, but there was something lighter in her expression than there had been before. "I'm just glad I could help make it right," she said. Ava tugged on Claire's sleeve. "Are you the one who helped my daddy?" Claire knelt down so she was at Ava's eye level. "I tried to." Ava threw her arms around Claire's neck in an impulsive hug. Claire froze for a moment, then slowly returned the embrace, her hand coming up to rest on the back of Ava's head. When Ava pulled back, she was grinning. "You should come have dinner with us sometime. Daddy makes really good spaghetti." Claire looked at Thomas, who shrugged with a small smile. "I'd like that," Claire said. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed quietly. Thomas returned to work on the Monday after the hearing. His co-workers welcomed him back with handshakes and apologies, small gestures that acknowledged what had happened without dwelling on it. Marcus pulled him aside and said he was sorry for signing that form, that he should have read it first. Thomas told him it was okay, that he understood. Brian Holt was officially terminated on the 30th of December. The company issued a brief statement about policy violations and process improvements. Thomas heard through Marcus that Brian had accepted a settlement in exchange for not pursuing legal action. The whole thing was resolved quietly, the way companies always resolve their mistakes. Thomas didn't think about Brian much after that. He had more important things to focus on. On New Year's Eve, the city held its annual holiday lights ceremony in the downtown square. Thomas had taken Ava every year since she was 3, back when his wife was still alive. It was one of their traditions, something that felt both sad and comforting in the way all grief-touched memories did. They arrived just before sunset. The square was already crowded with families bundled in winter coats, drinking hot chocolate from vendor stands and waiting for the lights to come on. Ava spotted the carousel near the center of the square and begged Thomas to let her ride it. "Just once," he said, handing her $3 for a ticket. While Ava rode the carousel, Thomas stood watching her, his hands in his pockets. She waved at him every time she came around, her face bright with uncomplicated joy. Someone touched his shoulder. He turned and found Claire standing there, wearing a gray coat and a scarf wrapped around her neck. "Hi," she said. "I hope you don't mind. Ava mentioned you'd be here when I dropped off some paperwork at your house yesterday." Thomas smiled. "I don't mind." They stood together, watching the carousel turn. After a moment, Claire spoke. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, and for most of that time, I thought the point was to protect the company, to follow the rules and minimize liability. But helping you, it reminded me that the rules are supposed to protect people, and when they don't, they're not worth following." Thomas looked at her. "That's a dangerous way to think when you work in HR." "Maybe," Claire said, "but I'd rather be dangerous than useless." The carousel slowed to a stop. Ava climbed off and ran toward them, throwing herself at Thomas's legs. He caught her automatically, lifting her up. "Miss Claire," Ava said, delighted. "You came." "I did," Claire said. "I hope that's okay." Ava reached out and grabbed Claire's hand, then grabbed Thomas's hand, creating a chain between the three of them. "The lights are going to come on soon," Ava announced. "We have to find a good spot." She pulled them toward the center of the square, weaving through the crowd with single-minded determination. Thomas and Claire followed, their hands still connected through Ava's grip. When the lights came on, thousands of them, strung through the trees and wrapped around the gazebo in the center of the square. The crowd gasped in collective wonder. Ava's face tilted up toward the glow, her eyes wide and amazed. Thomas looked at Claire and found her looking back at him. She smiled, and he smiled back, and in that moment, surrounded by light and cold air and the sound of his daughter's laughter, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Not for a perfect future or an easy life, just hope that tomorrow might be better than today, that people could choose to do the right thing even when it cost them something, that brokenness could heal, slowly if you let it. Ava squeezed both their hands. "This is the best night ever," she declared. And standing there in the winter dark, Thomas thought maybe she was right.